Hey, everybody, and welcome to Immigration Law for Tech Startups. I'm your host, Sophie Alcorn, and I'm so glad you're joining us here today. I am joined by one of my friends and longtime business partners, Marc Pavlopoulos, and he's the founder of Syndesus and also Path to Canada. And these are companies that help people get jobs in Canada. And why we're talking about that on Immigration Law for Tech Startups, which is mostly a US focused podcast, you will see, but it is very, very, very relevant for our audience of motivated global professionals and startup founders who want to erase the artificial barrier of political borders covering our globe so that companies can succeed and talent can be in a place where life is good and you can focus on your job and being productive. So, Marc got his MBA in Canada, although he is an American, and he has extensive experience in tech and software and the VC ecosystem. And Marc, welcome. I'm so delighted to have you here with me. And hi.
Hi, thanks for having me on your
You're
podcast, Sophie.
so
Super
welcome.
appreciate it.
You're so welcome. And I want to also share with our audience that it's been fun because Marc has been growing his businesses for a similar time frame as I've been growing Alcorn Immigration Law and this podcast. And so we've powwowed in many different offices and restaurants in Mountain View over the years and compared notes about how we can help people. So it's fun to be on this journey with you.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, why don't you tell us about your two businesses? So one is Path to Canada and the other is Syndesus. What's the Cliff's Note version of what each of them do?
Cliff Notes version is, so my background's always been working with VC-backed tech companies in Silicon Valley or New York. So it's the world that I know. I've always been in sales and biz dev. So Syndesus is the first company I launched, and I'm basically everyone trades off a certain level of experience they have. Some people know it up front. Some people get to it later in their career. For me, I got to it later. It's basically looking backwards saying, hey, I'm an American. I lived in Canada 5 years, got my MBA up there, worked in venture capital in Canada, but I've always been based in Silicon Valley, or now I'm in New York. And then I have lots of friends in tech who basically, one theme I kept hearing them complain about was can't find qualified engineers, too expensive locally, India, China, too far away. And then at some point, I started posing questions to all my CTO and co-founder friends. I'm like, how about building a team up in Canada? And it always got a good response. There's always like oh, hey, we've got some Canadian engineers here. We've got some Waterloo engineers here. I'm like, they got many more up north, lower cost. And then the follow-up comment I always got, it was consistent, Sophie, was, oh, but Canada's like France. You can't fire anyone. Labor laws are crazy. I don't know how to do that cross-border currency thing. And I'm thinking, I worked up there. It's not like France. Labor laws actually are similar to the US. I witnessed them. And then it kind of clicked. It's like, there's your first company, Marc. You're going to do recruiting up there. You met some good recruiters. You're going to build engineering teams in Canada. But very quickly, what I learned was, I worked for VC-backed startups. And I remember the CFO always saying they're always busy. And so approaching a US company and saying, hey, do you want to figure out Canadian labor law? The answer was, no, I don't. Why don't you please solve that one too? So it became a recruiting company, but very quickly became a PEO because every US company's like, you find those good engineers, we'll find those good engineers, but you handle them. Handle that Canadian healthcare, handle employment. So that's how Syndesus started. And very quickly, of the two services, it's the PEO, it's the remote employment part that's lasted. That's the recruiting comes and goes depending on economy. But over time, what I find most of my US clients say, Marc, our recruiters in Seattle, the Valley, they found good people in Canada. We just need your help to employ them. Handle all the Canadian complexity, the payroll, the HR, the healthcare, make stock options work. And that's what Syndesus basically does. We employ Canadians remotely in Canada for US tech companies.
Okay, and we'll go more into the
And
PEO
then,
model in a minute, but so that's Syndesus, and what's Path to Canada?
so what I basically learned is, as if one company wasn't enough work, I also saw a problem in the market was a few years back, a few of my clients in New York actually in the Valley had asked, hey, look, we have workers who didn't get their H-1B, they can't stay. Can your PEO hire them in Canada? And I'm just like, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. Reached out to a Canadian immigration lawyer who said, your timing's really good. We just announced a new immigration work visa program in Canada called Global Talent Stream. We want to bring 200,000 people in. I'm like, that's nice. How do you qualify? I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that later. But basically, I started moving tech workers from my US clients who couldn't stay in the US, their OPT is expiring. Syndesus basically becomes a work sponsor. I moved them up. I sponsored the Canadian work visa. They're working in Canada. So after I moved about a half dozen people up, I thought, I'm moving a few people, 5, 10, 15, 20 a year. You know this number. It's in the thousands of people who have to leave the US every year permanently. And so I'm like,
Right.
well, why don't I do this? Why don't I help hundreds of people?
Yeah.
And my client no longer is the US company. Path to Canada basically is a marketplace. It's tech workers who can't stay in the US or want to leave. And I'm connecting them with Canadian tech companies or the branch of a US tech company. There's plenty of them in the Valley that open an office up there that have established themselves in Canada. They're the sponsor. So I basically vet the talent on the US side, make sure that they qualify. Everyone wants 4 years more experience, et cetera. Path to Canada connects them to a Canadian tech company. I'm like, I'm telling the Canadian tech companies, here's a vetted pool of US experience, US educated engineers who cannot stay in the US. Would you like access to them? And the answer always is, well, of course we do. So I launched that last year, just right before COVID, unfortunately, but that's what Path to Canada is. It's to help Canadian companies or US companies with an office in Canada bring this talent across, because if we don't help them, they're going back to home country. You know this, you have to deliver the sad news all the time to a tech worker saying, I'm sorry, this was the last try, and there's a very sad person leaving.
Not all
They
the
don't have to.
time. We
You're used to
we
it.
win 99% of our cases, Mark. But yes, there's a
But
lot of people who we just simply can't help or take on as a client at the beginning, and it is really sad because in this industry, it's not um widgets, it's like humans, and they care about their families and their
yeah.
homes, and yeah, it's holistic. So okay, so tell me about this article that featured you. It was recent, it was in May in the San Jose Mercury News. They profiled you on the front page, right?
Yes,
So
I was. It was
awesome.
a bit of a yeah. It was great because you never know with you get interviewed by a reporter, and the
Did you see it
reporter had done
coming?
a lot. No, the reporter said, "Hey, look, we're gonna." All he said was, "You're going to, we want to write about you." He's like, "I write about H-1B. That's one of the things I write about." He's like, "But you have this interesting angle. You could help people who can't stay in the U.S." He's like, "I've never heard of such a thing." And he's like, "Look, our readership is in Silicon Valley. People need to know options. What you do is interesting and it's unknown."
Yeah.
And I just thought it'd be like, "Oh, here's Entrepreneur of the Month. Be buried back, page 38 or something." We had two conversations. He dove in deep, but it was all about, here's two groups of people. Like I said, there's people who need help who can't
Yeah.
stay in the U.S. There's companies who did a lot of work to get someone who wants someone to stay that didn't work out. And he's like, you have a unique solution. So basically, he said, oh, you'll run next couple of weeks. I'm like, oh, that's great. And then a friend who lives in San Jose, I used to work at his startup way back in the early 2000s. He calls me up. He's like, got a minute? I'm like, sure. He's like, yeah, my wife and I just picked the paper up off the front porch and you're on the front page. Like, nice picture. And I just like frozen.
That's
but,
amazing. That's
but
so
it's good
exciting.
because what happened is the cascade, you can imagine the cascade of incoming inquiries from LinkedIn, calls to our company, emails of basically of people saying, I need what you offer. I need that
Yeah.
help.
Yeah.
My OPT is expiring. My company's not sure what to do. They're out of options. So the good news is the conversations that come from that of people who say, like, can you help? And in a lot
That's
of cases,
amazing. There's so much need for this. Um, and congratulations. And then you told me a funny anecdote. I hope it's okay to share this or your response. And you can fill in the details, but there may be at some point some interest in DC to explore this. And I think we were texting or chatting on the phone, and you're like, of course I'll help. I'm not un-American, right? So, how do you feel about that in terms of politics and economics and patriotism and being a business owner, and like what's your personal thing in all of this? Like, what would be a better situation for the tech economies in the two countries, and how things could work more fluidly?
It is a really good question because I have customers on both sides of the border, Canadian companies, US companies, and then I'm helping people directly. The perfect situation is, you're right, I'm an American, I'm concerned about this country, I want to see us win on a global level. The easiest thing is us having a work visa program, just like the Canadians do, which basically says, you're a tech worker, you have a tech degree, you know how to code, you're going to get a work visa in 4 to 6 weeks. That's the solution. That's what the Canadians have. And at the same time, I'm basically looking at this saying, and you and I have talked about a bit about this. I get comments from, oh, this election happened, Mark, things are different in the US. And I have to tell the Canadians this all the time. Does not matter who the US president is. You want to change H-1B policy, it's Republicans, Democrats getting together, passing legislation, revising a program which hasn't been done in decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And much as an American, I want to see that done, and I want to see us get better.
Mm-hmm.
The cynical side of me says, I don't see that happening. And I see a lot of very good people who tried to live the American dream, who did everything right to get here, having them told, no, you can't stay, you're going back to home country. Until we change our immigration system and our work visa program, which I hope we do, in the interim, I have a solution, and it's to the benefit of Canada. And unfortunately, it's to the detriment of the US, which is taking people with their last chance and saying, just go north of the border. I can help you get up there. You can even do the same job. You can actually move across the border, work for a US company, or you can find a job with a Canadian tech company.
Yeah.
But to your point, that's not going to build Silicon Valley. That's not going to give all the companies here, we have a shortage. We need these people.
There's a huge shortage, and it's happening now so intensely. I'm getting calls all the time. Sophie, we don't really want to touch immigration, but we guess we kind of have to now because it's so hard to recruit. And I think there's an apathy maybe, or a fear in Washington of doing anything on H-1Bs. But if somebody were to engage on it, I think they would probably say something like, oh my God, I don't want to take away jobs from US workers. But there's so many economic studies, and you probably see this in your day to day. The more jobs are created anywhere, the more jobs those jobs end up creating, and taxes and periphery services in the local economy. And it's not like this is a zero sum game. The Canadian and US economies could both grow if there was more openings for immigration in the US, probably.
Totally agree. Would love to see it change in the US, would love to see it get better here.
Yeah.
But I think there's a cynical side of me that says politics in the US is not going in that direction of compromise.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Syndesus and the PEO, because many people in our audience are in HR at US tech companies, and people ops and heads of talent, and do HR at VCs, and lots of people types of roles in various organizations. For somebody who's not familiar with a PEO or that model yet, can you please describe what that is?
Sure. It's in the US, most people will use a PEO. They'll pool together a bunch of workers, like at tech work companies I worked at, startups. Like, Mark, you're joining this company, but actually you're going to be employed by this PEO. We're pooling together people to get lower healthcare costs. But what it goes by different titles. PEO is professional employer organization. Some people call it employer of record, remote employment. It's all the same. The challenge is, and every week we get a call, an inquiry from a US company saying, we're about to give an offer letter out to Canadian. They're in Vancouver, or an AI specialist in Montreal. It could be a sales rep. It could be any worker they found in Canada. And the response comes back and then our lawyer said, well, we can't hire them. We don't have a Canadian entity. And then the HR person freaks out because they're like, but this person's perfect. Like, they're ideal for our firm. And then they Google remote employment, Canadian PEO. They find me. We have those first calls. And sometimes on the call, there's a harsh question that's brought up, and it's a good one. And they're like, Mark, why do we talk to you at all? We can just hire this person as a contractor. Like, we think we should use a PEO. We think we should use a third-party employer in Canada, but why can't we just send our contractor agreement? And that's what usually happens. A lot of US companies will hire someone on a contractor agreement. These calls are really easy when the lawyer's on the call and the Canadian worker's on the call, and then the VP of people or the HR person's on the call. because then I say, okay, let's cover all the issues all around the board. I go to the Canadian worker and I'll say, do you want stock options in this cool US company that you're about to get an offer from? The Canadian worker's like, well, yeah. I'm like, do you want to have foreign income as a contractor and then therefore have to get a tax specialist? And the Canadian's like, no, I really don't want that. And then I would say, well, do you want healthcare? There's Canadian healthcare, but there's also supplemental healthcare, like vision and dental. And I said, if you don't pay taxes in your province because you're a contractor, you won't get that. And at some point, the Canadian worker's like, yeah, that's not so good. And then HR usually speaks up and says, we treat our workers a certain way in New York, San Francisco, San Jose, Mountain View. They get perks and 401k and healthcare and benefits. And I say, yeah, as a PEO in Canada, I will handle that for you. We have all that set up for you. We'll bill you monthly. And then lastly, if the lawyer's in the call, I'll say, how do you feel about having someone employed remotely with a California or a Texas or a Florida agreement? And how do you feel about having your IP with a foreign worker on some US agreement? And the lawyer for the company, the GC, usually is like, I don't like this at all. I want a contract with this company, Syndesus. You're a Canadian corporation. You're legal. I'm looking at your contract right now. It's all Canadian law. I see that we're covered here. I see that you've handled things that we can't handle. So in that case, it's the easy solution for a US company looking to hire talent north of the border.
Yeah. And then once you have that set up, what's the basic qualification? I know you're not a Canadian immigration lawyer, but can you kind of describe who qualifies for the Global Talent Stream program so that if companies are considering expanding to Canada, they can also understand how they can access global talent and bring them to Canada and employ them in Canada?
And it's interesting. It's a process. So I just had a meeting with a client today in DC, and they had been using Syndesus for a PEO. So they had found someone in Canada, hired them. That was like a couple of years back. Then they approached me a few months back and said, okay, April passed, worker did not get picked, third and last try. You had mentioned you had this way to move people up to Canada. Now we need to engage with you to do that. And as you said, the qualification questions are, for Canadian work visa for Global Talent Stream, it's the first question is, basically, are you a tech worker or a manager of tech workers? So it works for both. You can be data scientist. It's basically covering most tech roles or the people who manage them.
Yeah.
You have to have a tech degree. You have to have tech work experience, 1 year or more. You have to have a job offer from a Canadian from a Canadian company. Syndesus is a Canadian company. So the conversations I have with the US companies are like, Mark, we have this worker that can't stay. I just had this conversation with this company in DC. They're like, that's it? I'm like, yeah, that's it. That's how you qualify for Canadian work visa.
Oh my
It's
God.
those things right there.
Yeah.
It's
So for
very open.
example, if that Canadian company or if the US startup was like, hey, and I'm thinking of one of our avid listeners who's from Africa and lives in Australia and has a tech degree and at least 1 year of tech work experience. And if the startup was like, hey, we want to hire this guy and move him from Australia to Canada, that could work probably for Global Talent Stream, assuming the person met those requirements.
Yes, that mirrors someone that we're moving right now. It's a crypto company out of Boston. They found one of their engineers is in Argentina. They'd worked with them before, and they knew they could never get them into the US. They're like, this isn't going to work. And
or call me, we can try.
like, no, wait a minute, no, there's a way. And I think the worker had expressed interest in living in Canada. So I get this call from an immigration lawyer and this crypto company and startup in Boston saying, here's this engineer, we want to get them into Canada. The Canadian immigration lawyer is like, I already pre-qualified them. They're going to fit for Global Talent Stream. Okay, Mark, go ahead and handle this. This company wants to move this worker up, and they're in the process of moving to Toronto right now.
Let's take then the flip of this scenario for that worker, because a lot of our listeners are professionals, engineers with a technology interest and background, and they dream of moving to the US one day to start a startup. But in the meantime, they're probably going to work at companies for several years. And the podcast has recently been trending in Estonia and Egypt and the Dominican Republic. So let's say somebody's in one of those countries and they're like, all right, I don't know how to get an offer from a US tech company that will sponsor me for an H-1B immediately, but Canada sounds nice, and maybe I could go there and become Canadian, and then maybe after that I could start my startup in the US, or at least I'd be closer and maybe it would be easier to visit and get things set up. So Can you just you mentioned this briefly, but that's what Path to Canada does, right? So if that person wants to find a job at a tech company in Canada, they could be in your database for that, right?
They could, and just to clarify, the first year of offering of opening up Path to Canada, the idea was I wanted to take people US educated, US experienced, who either couldn't stay in the US or just when they were told that their green card was a 40 or 50 or 60-year wait, they're like, H1B, no H1B, I can't live this way.
Right.
I
We
wanted
have
to
a
move them
lot
to
of
Canada.
people from India and China who are just stuck indefinitely in the United States with this ball and chain. And then there was all of that litigation about whether their spouses' work permits would still exist or not. And a lot of people were thinking they might have to leave the country under Trump. And then there's just also every year there's a million international students and there's 85,000 H1Bs in the lottery. So do the math, right?
Yeah, and that's, I would say this year my focus is help with Path to Canada is helping people who are in the US who want to move to Canada. The vision of it is globally. It's that,
Okay.
as exactly as you said, someone's working in Estonia, they're working in Ukraine, they have it, they go to a great school, they're doing great work, and they're like, I home country, I want to leave, I want to go to Canada. There, that's what I'm trying to get Path to Canada, the point of where it's like
Cool.
anyone from around the world, I can help you get into Canada and get a tech job. Because you're right, if you can't get into the US that way, I have these conversations every day, and I'm not a Canadian immigration lawyer, but I can make some
Yeah,
commentary.
let's talk about that cuz like if you're in Canada, visiting the US is easier. It's easier to get a visitor visa interview at a US consulate in Canada. You're in the same time zone. Um, and at some point, you might be able to get Canadian citizenship, and then that opens up other types of visas for you in the U.S. Do you know any? I know you're not an immigration lawyer in Canada, but generally, what's the path for people who go on Global Talent Stream to getting permanent residence or citizenship in Canada?
Yeah, so here's a high level of how it works. So global talent stream, say you qualify, you're an engineer, whatever your basic, you qualify, you have a job from a Canadian tech company, some Canadian tech startup hires you.
Mm-hmm.
You get global talent stream is a 2-year mostly work visa, renewable. You get that visa, then at that moment you get into Canada, you get a Canadian immigration lawyer and you say, okay, work on my permanent residence application. The work visa it's all point-based system in Canada. The global talent stream work visa gives you 50 points. Every year you work in Canada gives you more points.
Mm.
What I hear from Canadian immigration lawyers is by the time you hit the second year of your work visa, 99 or 98 super high percentage of people have already qualified for permanent residence.
Wow.
So by you don't have to renew. They're like, you don't renew the work visa because you're already a permanent resident. Now that you're a permanent resident, you're like, okay, I'm partway to citizenship. My understanding is roughly 4 years from when you land in Canada, you're a Canadian citizen. Now you can get a TN visa. So there's always a conversation with people. I'm like, look ahead, get Canadian citizenship, have that. It can never be taken away. Then you want to bounce down to the US. They're reaching out to your firm. It's
Sure.
like, come for
Get
a
an E2
TN.
investor visa, get a TN worker visa, get your
Yeah,
H1B finally, come as a visitor, and you don't need a visa and you can stay for 6 months and you can negotiate with all the VCs to try to raise money for your startup. There's a lot more
exactly.
options. Yeah. Yeah.
Canada opens the door to options to the US. Definitely does.
Man, when I hear about other countries' immigration systems for startups and tech, Estonia has a great program. New Zealand and Australia give people money. Canada has a great program also for startups. Um, and I want to hit my head against the wall because the US is losing so many opportunities in this space.
I
Our
know.
visa system is super antiquated. There's nothing where we try to recruit top world talent in the US. It's like an accident because our economy is so strong that people end up here and we try to keep them out. And so I see all these ways that the US could do a better job and just like copy a tiny bit of what Canada is doing,
Just rip it
you
off.
know?
Just copy.
Just
It's real
copy and
simple.
paste. Super
Yeah,
easy. But then, for
love to see that.
example, I spoke on this panel recently with the National Venture Capital Association about the new Startup Entrepreneur Pearl program, and there were representatives of Department of Homeland Security on the call, and they gave a great presentation, and they were very limited in the questions they could answer or what they could say because they're bound by the rules and they're not the people making the policies. They're just implementing it. And with our lovely decentralized democracy, it's just so hard to get any one person or entity to be able to take responsibility for creating such a huge, legal and program budgetary shift. But we're gonna, you and I, Mark, we're gonna take this on. We're gonna make it happen one day, one way or another, and we'll say, "I knew you when."
I know, because it's like sometimes you can dream of what it could be, but I've been on for years now on phone calls with Canadian immigration lawyers, US companies, tech workers in the US who can't stay. And I'm like, okay, here's this program, Global Talent Stream. It's 3.5 years old. Goal is to bring 200,000 people into Canada. It's brought over 50,000 in. It's like, it works. You don't have to create something from nothing. You could simply look at it and say, oh, a merit-based system that's not tied to quotas. And then you're building a tech. It's like you can look at it and be like, I'll just take that from up north and just copy that here.
Well, actually,
I wish. I mean,
that was something that our dear President Trump wanted to do. He just never got around to it. But that was one of his early proposals, was a merit-based, points-based immigration system. And there was so much Democratic opposition because it didn't value families, and how would you decide which skills to value? There's all sorts of arguments on both sides, but it could just be one piece. We don't have to
yeah,
take anything away from anybody. We could just add it.
yeah. We Americans are problem solvers. It's like it's like shortage of tech workers. Been going on for decades. Everyone knows it.
Right.
Solve part of it. Yeah, around. Yeah, it's we've all been
Oh my
enough of these
gosh.
calls and how frustrating it is. But
Well, Mark, what's next on the horizon for you? What are you looking forward to in this industry? What's exciting? What are new opportunities and developments?
unfortunately, what the conversation we just had about with the status of U.S. immigration, the conversations I'm starting to have with U.S. tech companies now is, I just had one over lunch with a tech company here in D.C. was, well, okay, things are what they are. Don't know if any changes are coming on the U.S. side. Let's build operations in Canada. Mark, can you help with that? Yes. Hey, let's move some of our let's move the people who can't stay up. Let's go around U.S. immigration. It's not changing. We're lobbying. We're trying. We don't hear it. And that was another meeting this morning. And I know this, you've heard this. Another Syndesus client said, it's too frustrating here in the US. And so I hear that, and for what I think is going to be happening for me is helping US companies with operations in Canada. It's going to be basically people just across the border working same time zone, just doing work for the US companies. So do US companies in Silicon Valley, can they find a way? Yes. The pandemic opened up the concept of, for many companies, of remote's okay. So I have more companies saying, like, Mark, I would never have had a Canadian office. That was a nice presentation you gave. Not interested. Well, wait a minute. Now we're interested. Add in remote, acceptable. Add in U.S. immigration policy, which is frustrating. And you enlightened us on this Canadian work visa. Okay, now we'll open the conversation with you. So that's what I see going forward is helping U.S. companies set up in Canada, just to take advantage of the system to still benefit. Obviously, it's not overseas. It's a near shore.
Right. Well, it's good that we are all creative solution seekers who are here to help
Yes.
our clients find a way forward to make their dreams a reality.
Yes.
And
And as you
thank
said,
you
it's about
for
helping people.
adding more options into the mix so that people can have a chance. Because at the end of the day, it's just people want a chance to succeed. And
It's that simple.
business is complicated enough.
Yes.
There don't need to be extra regulatory hassles on top of it. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. It's always fun talking to you, and really glad to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you. Very much appreciate you having me on your podcast.
Yeah,
Thanks,
my
Sophie.
pleasure. My pleasure. And everybody, do check out the show notes so that you can get the links to Syndesus and Path to Canada, and that San Jose Mercury News article that we mentioned will include Mark's contact information in the show notes as well. So you can reach out to him if you're interested in creating jobs in Canada for folks. And also in the show notes, you will see the link to our newsletter that you can subscribe to, where you can check out all the latest US immigration news and new strategies to make immigration possible, as well as our profiles of successful immigrant entrepreneurs who have made it in the United States. Do subscribe, share this episode with a friend. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next episode. Bye bye.